Good afternoon, and welcome to this Chemistry Well webinar on efficient modelling of polymers for industrial applications using molecular dynamics. My name is Jennifer Newton, and I'm the RSC Content Editor for Chemistry World. I'm here to introduce the webinar topic and introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Atif Afzal. We would love to hear from you during the webinar, so please use your GoToWebinar panel to interact with us, because we really want you to get involved. It's entirely customizable, so feel free to pull the bits out that you need and organize it how you like. GoToWebinar is an interactive platform, and you can submit questions for our speaker at any point by using the questions box in your GoToWebinar panel. It's usually somewhere near the bottom. Your questions are a really important part of the webinar experience, so please feel free to ask away. I should also say that we won't make the slides from today's webinar available separately, as we feel they are best seen in the context of the presentation. And now, on to what we're here for. By the end of this hour-long webinar, you will have learned why a wide variety of industries like pharmaceuticals, consumer packaged goods, and the automotive industry have adopted polymer materials through a selection of case studies, the value that simulations can bring in aiding discovery and design of next-generation innovative polymer systems, and how Schrödinger's computational chemistry software platform can give you the power to accelerate your own polymer R&D projects. Our partner for this webinar, of course, is Schrödinger. Schrödinger develops computational simulation software that allows users to leverage a deep understanding of physics, chemistry, and predictive modeling to accelerate innovation. Their industry-leading computational platform to accelerate drug discovery and materials design is deployed by leading biopharmaceutical and industrial companies, academic institutions, and government laboratories worldwide. We've worked with Schrödinger to find interesting topics, and they've also put us in touch with your speaker for today, Atif Afzal. Atif is an Associate Principal Scientist at Schrödinger in the Materials Science Division. His expertise includes modelling small organic molecules and polymers using molecular dynamics, quantum chemistry, and machine learning. Now, that's definitely enough from me, so I will hand over to Atif. Atif, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thank you all for attending this presentation today. All right, so assuming everyone can see my screen, I would like to get started. So as Jen mentioned, I'm Atif Afzal and a polymer application scientist at Schrödinger. And in today's presentation, I'll be talking about how polymer modeling is typically used in various industries. And we'll go into details of several of such case studies during the presentation. So here are some of the industries where polymers are extensively used. And I'll start with the consumer packaged goods here. Consumer packaged goods in which if we see around ourselves, we see a lot of polymers that are used in majority of our household products, like plastic bottles, like containers, and also in our food that we eat. And these days, food scientists are using cutting-edge technologies to make new innovative foods. A good example is the Beyond Meat company that makes basically meatless food, where food polymers are being used. And sometime soon, we will be seeing the lab-grown meat as well. Food polymers are polymers that are typically derived from edible plants, animals, microorganisms that can be used in food systems, including as proteins, polysaccharides, and peptides. So next up, we have the electronics industry. Polymers are typically used as a coating material on these electronic chips to protect them from the environment or from external solvents or from extreme temperature variations. Polymers are also becoming critical for display devices where we want the device to be very flexible and at the same time be very light to be used very easily. So imagine a flexible phone where there is no such thing as cracked skin because we are using polymer materials. Next, the biomedical devices and implants is another huge industry for polymers and for polymer innovation. For example, we have come a long way for contact lenses, where because of the polymer innovation, we are now able to wear contact lenses for throughout the day. Of course, we are still a long way to go when we can use the lenses for more extended periods of times. For this, we will need to redesign new polymers with extreme properties such as high oxygen permeation, wettability, and then also have suitable mechanical properties. When we typically hear polymers, the first thing that comes to mind is tires and rubbers. This is because this is one of the oldest industry for polymers. We have successfully moved from tube tires to tubeless tires, but we have seen that the transition and the time that took for this innovation was quite slow. But now with new structural advancements, tire industries are designing non-pneumatic tires, basically airless tires, which is now the holy grail for the tire industry. It is taking time to make this technology mainstream because these new airless tires require complete redesign of polymer chemistry. That is, we need polymers that have exceptional fatigue endurance, load-bearing capabilities, and creep and tear resistance. And on top of that, they also need to have strong adhesion to the metal surfaces of the vehicle. Next is the aerospace industry, which requires very high performance materials. We need materials that can withstand extreme temperatures. They are also extremely water resistant, and also they have to be lightweight. And of course, they need to be very mechanically stable. So they'll have to have exceptional mechanical properties. And we can find such properties in polymer composite materials, and also that require thermosets to be used in them. Lastly, I have here is a pharma industry. Polymers are critical components for pills. Majority of the drugs that we use are insoluble and therefore require polymer formulation for dissolving the drug and encapsulating it. Plus, we need to have a controlled release of the drug when it enters our body. So by controlling the chemistry of the polymer, we can also control the release behavior of the drug once the drug enters into our body. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list of industries. Polymers are also used in various other industries, such as adhesives, in paints, in cosmetics, etc. So this is great to know that polymers have such a wide application range. However, the big question today we want to answer is how simulations can provide value to these industries. And for that, I have divided it into three sections. The first one being the instantaneous value or the immediate value that we will get from the simulations, the value that is beneficial in near term for us, and most importantly, what's the value of the simulation in the long term. So I'll go over these three sections one by one. So let's start with the instantaneous value. So what I mean by instantaneous value is we can get the properties of materials of interest or polymers of interest where in just few hours using molecular simulations. For example, here I'm showing a method to calculate the glass transition temperature of polymers using molecular dynamics. Imagine if you have a polymer system that we want to synthesize in the lab and test it. Of course, that will require a intense amount of resources and time. So before we even go into the lab, what we can do is we can test and calculate the glass transition temperature of that particular polymer using molecular dynamics. And we have validated such a model against a large number of experimentally available glass transition temperature values from literature. And we have shown that the model is very good for getting an initial estimate for glass transition temperature of polymers. And additionally, we can understand any trends that we see in experiments. For example, what happens when we increase a certain component. All right, so we can understand the behavior in terms of the concentration of component and how does it impact the glass transition temperature, whether it's going to increase or decrease when we change certain component. And of course, we can also make comparison across different systems. For example, if we have a bunch of systems, we can rank order them based on properties of interest. Next, I have the near-term value, and I'm referring to manufacturing because simulation becomes an efficient tool for the manufacturers to communicate and interact with the vendors. That is, they can effectively show and represent their requirements through these tools. And also, we can use the simulations to get a root cause of certain phenomena. For example, if there is a failure or if there is some unusual behavior that we see in experiments, we can understand why this is happening using simulations. For example, what I'm showing here is an example of a drug release profile from two different formulations that use two different polymers. This was quite puzzling from the experimental point of view because this was kind of counterintuitive. And using simulations, we were able to understand what interactions are happening at the molecular level that is causing this unusual behavior. And once we have accurate models and techniques to evaluate the properties of polymers, we can go ahead and use those to design new polymers. So that will allow us to design new chemistries with targeted properties critical to design and processing constraints. And also, we can identify some unique candidates that will have extreme properties. As an example, what I'm showing here is a screening approach we did for thermosets, where we screened a bunch of epoxy groups and amine groups to identify some of the interesting combinations of those epoxy-amines to get the right thermoset for a specific application. I will go into the details of the specific case study later in my presentation. And so the goal of this today's presentation is to go over some of the values that simulations will provide in some of the industries that I mentioned earlier. So let's begin with the consumer packaged goods. Right. So we have seen this label quite often on our plastic bottles or containers, the BPA free. And if you're wondering what BPA is, it stands for bisphenol A, the chemical, this chemical, which is typically used for as a monomer for polycarbonate polymer. And it is also used as plasticizers for various other polymers that are used to make plastic bottles or plastic containers. And the reason we want BPA free in our containers is because this particular chemical is toxic and carcinogenic for both humans and animals. So we don't want this chemical to be leaching out from the container into our food or into our beverages. So in this work, we are trying to understand how, using simulations, how we can understand the leaching behavior of BPA from the plastic bottles to solution or beverages that we have. I'm also showing a commonly used dye that is shown here, and we don't really see labels such as dye free, and that is because the biggest concern is about BPA and not about the dye. And also the dye is bigger in structure and it also doesn't leach as the BPA does. So in this particular case, we will use this dye as a control and then have as a comparison to what the BPA leaching characteristics would look like in comparison of this dye. So you might be thinking, like, how do we do the simulation? So we do this by creating an interface, just like in the real situation. That is, we create an interface between the polymer that is representing the plastic bottle and then interfacing it with the solution, which is what will be in the beverages. So in this case, we are using ethanol 60% and water 40% as a solution. And in the polymer matrix, we are embedding it with the BPA and the dye. So the dye is pink in color and the green part is representing the BPA molecule. So we did this, we take this simulation cell and then did the simulation at various temperatures to also understand what the leaching characteristics would look like with increasing temperature. So here I'm showing the snapshots from to different temperatures ranging from 300 to 350 Kelvin and seeing how BPA leaches into the solution. So of course, as we increase the temperature, we are seeing an increase in the leaching characteristics. And more or less above room temperature, we is seeing the leaching occurs, or at least it begins to leach. So that's one of the reasons you might be thinking, like, why liquor is stored in like glass bottles and not plastic bottles. And this is the reason why. So the ethanol typically accelerates the leaching behavior of any of the plasticizers that is present in the plastic bottle. Right. So this is a nice way of looking qualitatively how the leaching occurs. And we can also quantitatively look at the diffusion characteristics. The first thing we can do is look at the density profiles of different components that are there in the system. For example, here at 300 Kelvin, we are seeing what the density of these added molecules would look like, and what's the density of ethanol or water look like. Of course, there is no leaching happening, so you can see the density is 0 for the BPA, whereas we are seeing small amounts of ethanol and water penetrating in the surface, but it's only at the surface. So it's going to be free of water and ethanol at the center of this polymer matrix. Another way to quantify this is to look at the diffusion characteristics of the BPA. So here I'm calculating the mean square deviation of BPA at two different temperatures. The blue one is at 350 Kelvin and the orange is at 300 Kelvin. So this is isotropic diffusion, and we can already see that there is a significant difference at two different temperatures. But the most important thing to note here is we want to understand the diffusion in this direction, that is the lateral directions. In this particular case, this is the Y direction. So if once we separate those out, so when we look at the diffusion in Y-axis for BPA, we see a significant difference as we go from 300 Kelvin to 350 Kelvin. All right. So to summarize this particular work, we were successful in creating an interface between a plastic bottle and the solution, and understanding how the chemicals leach out from the polymer matrix into the solution, and also the temperature dependence. Right. So now we want to understand what's value we were able to get from these simulations. So in terms of the immediate value that we got, we were able to understand that BPA leaches into the ethanol solution at above room temperature. And in terms of the intermediate value, the near-term value that we get from these simulations is now we are able to get leaching characteristics of BPA. And we can also do the same thing for BPA characteristics in another polymer. So this is polycarbonate, so we can understand BPA characteristics. Now that we have this protocol, we can apply it easily to other polymer systems and understand how the leaching would look like. And in the long term, using this established protocol, we can screen a large number of combinations of polymers with different plasticizers or dyes. So this will give us a better picture of where we need to look for, or how to find the better pairs of polymers and plasticizers. Right. So that was for the CPG industry. So now I want to change to a different industry, aerospace industry. Right. Thermosets is one of the type of polymers that are used in the aerospace industry. This is because they have favorable thermomechanical properties. And because of such properties, does not only find application in aerospace, but also in automotive industry, defense industry, and also in high performance athletic equipment. While thermosets are very versatile, the cost to incorporate these polymers into new materials is quite high. So acceleration of development process pipeline would not only reduce cost, it would also decrease accumulation of thermoset waste, which is very difficult to recycle. So in this particular example, I'll be showing the use of thermosets, specifically the epoxy-amine thermosets. In epoxy-amine thermosets, there are two types of reactions that occur during the cross-linking. The first one is the primary amine reaction, where the primary amine undergoes an addition reaction to form an hydroxyl group and a secondary amine. The secondary amine can further undergo a reaction with the epoxide to form a tertiary amine group and additional hydroxyl group. So if you look at the primary amine reaction, this reaction can occur in the absence of a catalyst or in the presence of several different catalysts. So we looked at various possibilities of reactions. And using automated reaction workflow tool in material science suite, we were able to get the reaction pathways for all of these possible combinations. That is from going from amine and epoxy to the secondary amine and the hydroxyl group. And we can look at what transition states is resultant depending on what catalyst is being used, and also the corresponding activation energies required. And depending on whatever the R group is used for amine or epoxy, the energies would be different. So we can change the R groups and then control the reaction energies for these systems. So in this work, we enumerated different amine groups and epoxide groups. And for example, here I'm showing there's 12 amine groups that we use and 21 epoxide groups. This resulted in a total of 252 epoxy-amine combinations. And using this automated workflow, we calculated the activation energies, which is shown in this table here, for all of those 252 combinations. This was a very high throughput screening approach, and it involved about 500,000 DFT calculations. So once we have these activation energies for all of the reactions, we pick the most interesting combinations to perform the cross-linking using molecular dynamics. So we selected bisphenol A as one of the epoxides, and the other epoxide was a combination of bisphenol A with PT gap, and the third was bisphenol A with NPG epoxide. And these three epoxides we again mixed with three different amines, 4,4-DDS, JA, TEAE, that resulted in a total of 9 epoxy-amine systems. And we compared different properties, structural properties, glass substitution temperature, water uptake of these 9 systems. Before I go into the properties, let me show you how we are doing these cross-linking simulations. We first start out with an amorphous cell of the epoxides and amine groups in the simulation cell, and then we do a molecular dynamic simulation to equilibrate the system. And then subsequently, we start with the cross-linking process, where iteratively it does the bond making and then MD simulations in back and forth process. And here I'm showing a small trajectory that shows the formation of cross-linking bonds during our simulation. So the black color bonds that you're seeing here is actually the cross-link bonds. Here in this particular case, we do the simulations until we obtain 90% curing. And during the cross-linking process, we can track several properties to understand how the cross-linking is happening, and also we can get some properties along the way. For example, one of the important properties is gel point. Gel point is a point where during the cross-linking, the system changes this viscosity abruptly. That is, it goes from liquid state to a solid state. And this is one of the important properties that we need to understand, because it defines how difficult it's going to cross-link a system. And it is one of the properties that is challenging to obtain from experiments. So using such methods, we are able to get this gel point. In this particular case, we define the gel point as the point where 50% of the system becomes a single molecule. So, and we did this gel point calculations for all of the 9 systems. And we also looked at other properties. The other one being the glass transition temperature. In this particular case, we get the density profile with the temperature for each of the systems. So we start out with at a higher temperature and then get the densities, and then the stepwise fashion decrease the temperatures to get the whole density profile. And using that profile, we get the glass transition temperature of the polymers. And also we computed the equilibrium water uptake in these systems using grand canonical Monte Carlo simulations, and compared across all of these 9 systems. So let's look at the results of these 3 properties, starting out with the gel point. Here are the results, where on the y-axis, I'm showing the 3 different epoxy groups that we selected, and then the x-axis, I have the 3 different amine groups. The color of each of the block represents the gel point. The darker the color, the higher the gel point is. So clearly, we are seeing a very nice trend. For example, addition of NPG to bisphenol A increases the gel point, and addition of PT gap actually decreases the gel point. So some interesting observations can also be derived from such an observation. The other property was the glass sensation temperature. In this case, addition of NPG decreased the glass sensation temperature for bisphenol A, whereas addition of PTGAP increased the glass sensation temperature. So for an application where we want high TG values, this might be a good system. However, we have to note that looking at the gel point, it has a lower gel point. So that means it will be challenging to cross-link this particular system. And the last property we calculated in this case was the water uptake. And here also we are seeing some nice trends. That is, addition of NPG would increase the water uptake, and addition of PTGAP further increases the water uptake capacity of the system. And now again, let's assume a scenario where we want a polymer for an application where it has to have high glass sensation temperature, but it also needs to be water resistant, right? So in terms of glass sensation temperature, again, this particular system with PTGAP and FOFO-DDS appears to be very attractive. However, it also shows that it has a high amount of water absorption occurring. So that might not be the best candidate for this particular application. So depending on the application and the requirements, we can pick the right candidates that we want based on some of these systematic studies that we are doing here. To summarize this particular case study in the aerospace industry, we successfully enumerated 252 epoxy-amine combinations and obtained the activation energies that involved about 500,000 DFT calculations. We selected some of the interesting epoxy-amine pairs and performed molecular dynamics to obtain a cross-linked network. And then we compared different properties such as glass sensation temperature, water uptake, and also the gel point of these systems. Now, coming back to what value we obtained from these simulations. So in terms of immediate value that we obtained, so we got these structural and thermophysical properties for the systems and able to quickly pick the most interesting or the most appropriate one for a specific application. In the near term, now because of this systematic study, now we have a better understanding of how different functional groups are impacting the properties of interest. So that way we are able to learn more and more from this. And so over in the near term, should be able to get a better understanding of which functional groups to use. And for the long-term benefit, because we did a high throughput screening of the epoxy-amine combinations, now we can identify the most unique combinations. And because now we have a lot of data available too, we can understand better structure property relationships from these data sets. All right, so that was for the aerospace industry. And I want to now move on to a different industry, the pharma industry, where we use the formulations. Here, I'll start out with a very interesting experimental observation that was published in a paper in 2015. Here, what I'm showing is the drug release from two different formulations. So the first one is containing the polymer copovidone, and a mixture of copovidone with the drug in the dry form is typically referred to as ASD, which stands for amorphous solid dispersion. So in this case, it's an ASD of copovidone with the drug ibuprofen. Copovidone is a block copolymer, sorry, the random copolymer of vinyl pyrrolidone with vinyl acetate. And when we make a pill out of this polymer with ibuprofen drug and immerse it into a solution, so here is what the drug release looks like. So in this, if you look at the top plots over here, the fluorescent green refers to the actual pill, and the blue color is the solution around it. So the moment it's immersed, it starts to disintegrate, and during 30 minutes of immersion, we're seeing that the drug is completely coming out of the drug or the pill, and the polymer is also completely dissolving into the solution. So when we replace this polymer copovidone with another polymer soluplus, which is a surfactant-like polymer, that is, it has hydrophilic end, which consists of polyethylene glycol, and the other end is a random copolymer of vinyl acetate and vinyl caprolactam. Intuitively, by looking at this polymer structure, we might think that this would be a very good polymer for dissolving the drugs in the solution. However, the experimental studies show that the drug doesn't really come out of this even after 30 minutes, and the polymer stays pretty much intact. So that's not allowing any drug to come out, or the polymer is also not dissolving into the solution. So this was a very unusual behavior from once we got the experiment studies, right? So we want to understand if we can get insights into this unusual behavior using simulations. So we did this simulations using creating an interface. So here we create an interface of ASD with solution. So the pink AS part is actually a copovidone with ibuprofen, and the green part here is a different simulation that is for the soluplus. And we want to see what happens and the simulation goes on if the drug comes out and if the polymer is dissolved into the solution. This was a very big system, and it required a large simulation time. For example, in this case, we did 24 microseconds of simulation, as it takes time, was taking time for the drugs to come out. But what we see here is copovidone. Eventually the drug completely comes out of the system, and the copovidone polymer chains dissolves into the solution. Whereas soluplus, on the other hand, doesn't really change in shape. It just forms a bilayer, which is also an interesting phenomena to note here, is because of that hydrophilic part that is blue color in here, that is containing polyethylene oxide. It forms kind of a protective layer around the remaining part of the polymer, which encapsulates the drug inside. So that doesn't allow any of the drugs to come out of the solution. And we can also look at the trajectories. For example, I'm showing here the copovidone system trajectory, where we can see that the black particles that represent the drug coming out of the solution, and also the polymer chains, which are pink in color, are dissolving. This shows a nice view of how these drugs are coming out of the ASD. And in addition to the qualitative analysis that I'm showing here, we can also do some quantification of what the density profile of individual components would look like. So for example, in CPV, which is copovidone, we are seeing that the densities profiles of all of the components do change, whereas in soluplus, we are not seeing any change in the density profiles. And in addition to just looking at the interface, we can also look at the bulk simulations, which also refer to the late stage dissolutions. That is when the polymers and the drugs dissolve into the solution completely. So what happens then? And this will give us information about what's the level of interactions that are happening between different subunits of polymers with either the drug or the water, right? So here, what I'm showing is the interactions with the drug with the monomers. If we focus on copovidone, the vinyl pyridone shows a stronger interaction in comparison to the vinyl acetate. And when we come to soluplus, polyethylene oxide, which is blue in color, doesn't really interact with the drugs, whereas there is a very strong interaction with vinyl acetate, more than what was observed in the copovidone. As you can see, the same monomer showing more stronger interaction in the soluplus. And also the S3, which is vinyl caprolactam, shows a much stronger interaction with the drug. And that is the reason why the soluplus strongly attracts the drug molecules, the ibuprofen molecule, in comparison to the copovidone. And we have also done the similar interaction studies for water, which I'm not showing the results here, but we are seeing the completely opposite effect on that one. That is, copovidone has a stronger interaction with the water compared to the soluplus. So, and that's the reason why we are seeing such a release profile of drugs. So, because the soluplus is entrapping the drug molecules, it's not allowing for the release, and that is limiting the release profile of the drug in those systems. So to summarize this case study, which is a very nice example where we can get insights into some of the unusual behaviors that we see in the experiments by understanding what levels of interactions are happening and how competing effects of different components and different molecular structures impacts an experimentally observed phenomenon. So now coming back to the value that we obtained from these simulations. So in terms of near-term value, we were able to just get compare different drug and polymer combinations and understand which of those pairs actually dissolves faster at a given condition. And in terms of the value we obtained in near term, because now we have a better understanding of these interactions that occur at the molecular level, we have a better understanding of the reason for the delayed release of drugs in the solute system. And for the long-term benefits that we are getting from the simulation is we have established a nice protocol for evaluating a certain polymer for this specific drug. For example, if there is a new drug that was discovered for a certain thing, we want to have a specific polymer that is designed just for that drug. That way we can have a more controlled and desirable release of drug once it enters the human body. So yeah, this type of analysis would allow us to screen a bunch of polymers and then pick the right and appropriate polymer for a specific drug. So that was for the formulations. And next, lastly, I want to touch a different industry, that is the tire and rubber industry. One of the challenging problems in the tire industry to solve is how we can get more and more efficient recycled rubber. If I can bring the attention to the top microstructure here, which is the ground tire rubber, GTR. And this is, we can see that the surface of the ground tire rubber is very rough, and it just using ground tire rubber, it will be difficult for it to further crosslink to make a recycled rubber. So what we can do is we can coat this particle with a trans polyoctanomer, which is commercially known as Westernemer, to modify the surface of the ground tire rubber. As you can see, it's becoming more polished or more smooth. And doing so, we can now very efficiently recycle these ground tire rubbers further to make a more efficient recycled rubber. Westernemer is of interest here because it has high crystallinity, low melting point, low glass transition temperature, and also high thermal stability. And most importantly, it is very similar in structure to the other rubber commonly found rubber polymers. However, you might be thinking, like, why not just use this as the rubber itself? Well, of course, it has a very low Mooney viscosity. That's why it's not typically used as a rubber, but it is used as a component in the rubber formulation. And when we add this as a component, then the critical thing to consider is how compatible Westernemer is with other components of the rubber formulations. That will be like different crosslinkers and different other base polymers that are being used in that formulation. So the goal is to evaluate the compatibility of Westernemer with other crosslinkers and also with other base polymers. For this, we selected four different crosslinkers as an example to study: stearic acid, sulfur S8, TBZ-TD, and then the CBS, the crosslinker. And for polymers, we have three different polymers: Westernemer, and styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, and natural rubber, which I'll refer to as NR. The first thing we looked at was looking at the polymer-polymer compatibility by looking at the energy of mixing of these systems. Looking at the energy of mixing, we can see that because the energies are positive here, it's not favorable to mix any of those two polymers. So when we mix these polymers, most likely we will see a multi-phase existence of these systems. And this has also been seen from the simulation cells that we see here. We did the same thing for crosslinker in polymer as well. And in this case, we were also increasing the concentration of polymers in the specific polymer. Sorry, the concentration of crosslinker in the polymer and tracking the energy of mixing. And what we see here is the energy of mixing is dependent on the amount of crosslinker that is added. For example, for S8 and CBS, we are seeing a continuous increase in the energy of mixing. That means the more the concentration of this crosslinker, the most immiscible it's going to be. So it's going to be separating out. And for stearic acid and TBZ-TD, we don't see such a dependence. Right. So The other important thing to note here is we're not seeing any difference between the three polymers, that is the Westernemer, SBR, and the natural rubber. However, experimentally, we know that there are differences between these three polymers. It's not that we are doing anything wrong in these simulations, it's just that this is not the right place to look for those differences. One of the important aspects in cross-linking is how the cross-linker diffuses in these polymer matrices, and that really defines the cross-linking capability of the systems. So we evaluated the diffusivity of different cross-linkers in all the three polymer systems. And what we note here is for all of the cross-linkers, we see a high diffusion in Westernemer compared to natural rubber and SBR. And that is one of the key reasons why Westernemer is superior in terms of cross-linking when compared to natural rubber and SBR. And to summarize this example, we looked at the energy of mixing to compute the compatibility of polymer-polymer as well as crosslinker in polymer. And we understood the diffusion is critical for these systems where we can understand which polymer crosslinker pair would be good for crosslinking. And now, again, back to the value that we obtained. This instantaneous value or the immediate value that we got here was we were able to evaluate the miscibility of crosslinkers in various polymer systems. For the near-term benefit, we understood the diffusion characteristics of crosslinkers in polymers, and we understood that diffusion is critical. That clearly distinguishes which polymers are going to be better for cross-linking and for the recyclability of rubber. And going back to the value in long term, we get from the simulations, and we have seen the same thing across all the different examples that I showed here. That is, we have the simulations. Because we have the simulation techniques, we can now understand the interactions for various possible combinations of polymers and crosslinkers. So we can design better polymer systems, better compatible crosslinkers, and additionally optimize processing of cross-linked systems depending on how fast the crosslinker diffuses in these new systems. So that was the last case study that I wanted to present. And before I end, I would like to leave everyone with some final remarks for polymer design and development. In the past, whenever we saw or thought about simulations, the typical notion is that the simulations are used to explain some experimentally observed result. That is, we used to do experiments first and then do the simulations next. But now we are in a new paradigm where we can compute and simulate first and then go do these experiments. And this has proven to be very successful, especially in the drug design space. We have now to take full advantage of this approach in the polymer design space. Along with some unprecedented availability of hardwares, and the advanced tools that we put more and more readily accessible, even for small scale projects. So along with some unprecedented availability of hardware, this new paradigm is more and more readily available for even for small scale projects. Most importantly, the use of such an approach would allow for significant reduction in time by accelerating the product development cycle. So this is primarily because it will significantly reduce the number of experiments that we will need to perform. In some cases, this is almost 80% less number of experimental works that needs to be done. And on top of that, what we have seen is that the customers using such approach have a clear advantage over their competitors because they have a better understanding of their systems and have an economical impact on the product development cycle. The last thing I want to mention here is circle back to what I was talking throughout my presentation regarding the long-term benefits of simulations. And I think the really important long-term value from simulation is being able to design new polymer systems. However, we cannot just design polymers just from the physics-based simulations. By that means we can get the properties from the simulations, but we will need a complete platform to go from properties to actually designing new systems. What is shown here is the complete discovery platform. In this platform, we combine physics-based modeling with machine learning and informatics tools. This is to accelerate the screening process of polymer candidates. And we need to be able to communicate and collaborate the results with experimentalists and also with other people who are involved in the project. Such a collaboration is possible using Live Design, which is our enterprise solution for data management and collaboration. And what we are showing here is a complete platform that allows for an efficient design of next generation of polymer materials for specific applications.
Thanks for that, Atif. There was a great deal of information in there. So if you find you've got any questions after the webinar has ended, Atif is more than happy for you to email him at atif.afzal@schrodinger.com. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. If you have any further questions, then please drop us an email at cwwebinars@rsc.org. And that marks our last Schrödinger webinar of 2021. So once again, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Atif Afzal, who is an Associate Principal Scientist at Schrödinger, who were our partners for this webinar and will be our partners for more webinars next year. Based on the number of questions we've received, this was clearly a topic of interest, and we are delighted to have worked with Schrödinger on this webinar. I'm Jennifer Newton, and this was a Chemistry World webinar. See you in 2022 for the next one.
Thanks, Jen.